Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad you are able to join me. I know it's Monday morning, so I'm going to do my best to be as entertaining and to wake you up as much as possible. And there's nothing better for that than talking about native plants. And so this class will follow the 3-week schedule, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about in subsequent talks or in the next couple of weeks. But for today, I'm going to concentrate mostly on native plants for sun and shade. And this is just kind of something I call attention to for everybody who participates to let people know that we provide equal access to everybody. And if anybody has accommodation that they require, especially for the next 2 classes, since I have you, please just let me know or email Shane and I, and we'll do our best to accommodate you as well as possible. All right, so just a quick introduction about who I am. And my name is Mikaela Boley, and I'm the Principal Agent Associate here in Talbot County for the University of Maryland Extension Service. So basically, my role is to take unbiased, scientifically based information that the university spends a lot of time researching and brings it to communities so that, you know, education should be for all, not just people who are going to the university itself. So this is kind of part of my job is to do outreach. And of course, to talk about native plants is just one of the many jobs that I get to fulfill. But some of my background includes a bachelor's in environmental horticulture and specifically landscape design. And I actually completed that at the University of Minnesota, but more recently I did receive my master's in applied entomology. So that you'll notice, especially next week when I talk more about pollinators, is a lot of my talks skew towards entomology or the study of insects because it's such a relevant topic, but it's also some of what my studies have been included in. Okay, so for today, and you're going to see a lot of plant lists that I've created to hopefully narrow down for people what kind of plants might be useful in the landscape. But I will be happy to send a PDF copy or a file to everyone to make sure that you have those lists for yourself so you don't have to take pictures of the screen, you don't have to frantically try and write it down or type it. I will be sharing these lists with you so that you don't have to worry about taking notes and you can kind of concentrate on asking your questions and kind of tuning into what I'm saying. But real quickly, if you don't mind, I have a question that I just put in the chat box. And I just want you to sort of give me an idea about your confidence or your knowledge in using native plants in the landscape. I like to get a good idea whether people have no background or that you know, this is your first kind of foray into native plants, or whether you've been learning about native plants for years and years and years. So if you just want to put a number, you don't have to participate, but it just kind of helps me get an idea of where everybody is. And so we'll take just a couple more seconds to do that. Okay. So a lot of the middle of the road. So people have had some learning about it. Great. Okay. Well, I really appreciate getting an idea of where everybody is at. And you should not feel ashamed to ask your questions, by the way, if you feel like there's no silly questions. I've heard everything and nothing is silly. The only silly thing is to not ask your question. So great. So somebody just is new to the area. And actually we find that a lot with populations out here on the Eastern Shore. A lot of the people I work with are people who have moved here, especially recently, myself included. I'm not from here originally. I'm from the Midwest. And so this is a very different kind of palette to work with. And it's a very unique environment to work with. Excellent. Okay. Thank you guys. That really helps me kind of understand. And another thing I'm going to be doing is sending you emails in between the weeks, not only with resources that we've talked about in class, but I may have a survey here or there or some questions. Again, you know, your participation is totally voluntary, it's totally anonymous, and it just helps me get an idea of how to lead my programs and make sure that I'm teaching what I'm supposed to be teaching. And your feedback really helps with that. So I really, really appreciate it. All right, so here's what we're going to kind of concentrate on today. And I realize doing our introduction here eats up a little bit of time. So I'm going to try and keep this to an hour as much as possible, but I also want to make sure there's time for questions. So as we approach the end of the hour, I'll make sure to either wrap it up or to make sure that we get to those questions. So the first thing I like to address is what makes a plant native, and we're going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about evaluating a site properly, because it's something we don't really think about. We think we go to the plant nursery, we kind of look at what we like, and we buy it and then we take it home, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fit the growing conditions that are existing. And I always like to work backwards that way. Make sure you're looking at plants that are appropriate for your location, and not try to fix the location for the plants that you want to buy, because that never turns out very well. You could go through a lot of plants and money that way. So I'm hoping to help you kind of avoid that. And in fact, a lot of native plant choices are made because these plants have special adaptations to sort of adverse or strange growing conditions, where like turf isn't working out, or maybe you know, a crepe myrtle that hasn't made it. And I'm also going to cover a lot of plant lists. And again, I might race through those plant lists a little bit just for the sake of time, and also to make sure that we get on to topics that you're more interested in. Okay, so what makes a native? This is a very hot topic, and it's a topic that gets tossed around a lot, and a term that gets used quite a bit. You know, you go to the nursery and the words native are on the plant label. Well, you know, it could be argued that the plant is native to somewhere, right? So native to where is the question I always like to ask. But when we talk about native plants, it's something that is occurring naturally or has a history of growing here in this ecoregion and habitat. So, you know, Eastern Shore, and it's been that way over the course of evolutionary time, where they have actually adapted to the physical conditions, which makes them so good for some of the challenges that we have, like saltwater. And they have also co-evolved with all of these insect species that are also indigenous to the area. And so they have value in terms of supporting that wildlife and supporting those species. Whereas a lot of our non-native species, even though ornamentally they might be very attractive to us, they might serve a purpose in the landscape, it's quite possible and, you know, probable that they don't really support any insect life, and that's a really critical component of using native plants. So I know we'll cover that more later, but I just wanted to kind of set the tone so you guys understand what I mean when I say native plants. And one that often gets confused, or one that's used a lot, is the purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. So it actually has high wildlife value, and I really like it as a landscape plant, but it's technically not native, especially to the Eastern Shore, but I don't think it's even native to Maryland. If it is, it would be further west. And so in some ways we have to think about whether native plants are adapted to our area, even if they're native to the state we live in, right? So it, as local as you can get, sort of is the better for native plants. So why do we look at native plants? You know, why bother? You know, I have perfectly fine boxwoods all over my property. Well, native plants have a lot of benefits to them, some of which include adapting to different environments. So, you know, we have very heavy wet soils out here on the Eastern Shore, which makes sense because our parent soils are all made up of alluvial deposits that have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And so we don't really have any bedrock, so to say. So if you went out west, of course, you know, in the mountainous regions, you're seeing actually bare stone or bare bedrock, and we would not find bedrock here unless we drill down. I think it's like 1 or 2 miles into the to the Earth's core. So, we have just that wide variety of environments, just thinking about Maryland in that way. And our native plants are also biologically diverse, and that's going to be a key component, especially as we as homeowners battle climate change and some of the challenges that climate change presents. Because native plants are going to not only be able to be adapted to sort of this climatic shift, but is going to provide more, we call it biodiversity, where you're supporting a wide variety of not just plant species, but insect species as well. That's critical. And of course, our native plants are habitat and food for the insect dependents. One example I like to use, I like to pick on crepe myrtles a lot. I'm really sorry about that. I have them at my house, so I don't judge anybody. But I like to pick on crepe myrtles because if we had to think about how many caterpillar species do you think crepe myrtles support? You don't need to put it in the chat box or anything. You can just think about it. You probably are getting where I'm going with this. Crepe myrtles only support one species of caterpillar in the Lepidopteran family, compared to some of our native oak species. Oak species provide food for over 534 species of caterpillar. So if we're talking about the impacts that native plants can make in comparison with some like non-native ones, it's pretty drastic. I mean, the numbers don't lie. So that's why, we talk so much about native plants. They also serve more of that ecological purpose, not just attractive for us, which I argue native plants are just as attractive as non-native stuff. But they also serve a purpose and a role in the environment, not just for insects, but for our ecology as well. And the hope is that if you're planning and planting it properly, hopefully these plants are also less maintenance. That's the goal, I think, in life is the less work I have to do, the better. So what about those non-native plants? Of course, we have them in the landscape. There's kind of no way to avoid it. They really have sort of spread and become very, very common. I think the biggest takeaway is that you're just including a good biodiverse environment. So you're not planting just one species, which, by the way, is what turf grass is. It's just one species of plant that's planted a lot. There's a lot of little turf grasses. But the more species that we can kind of introduce to our landscape is going to be the key element, right? So not planting just one species and then replicating it. And if you can, doing a mix of 70% native and 30% ornamental. They've actually done research on this, is sort of like a composition ideal. If you can get more natives than that, that's great. But a 70 to 30% ratio has shown to be still as beneficial as like 80 to 20%. And like I said, non-native plants create what we call food deserts for insects and birds. Again, turf grass is another one I like to pick on. I also have turf grass. So that's a non-native species that doesn't offer really anything in terms of food for our critters. The only thing that really eats it is Japanese beetles, right? And those are a pest species. So, you can think about it that way if you really want. But so the idea is that we're introducing a lot more species, a lot more variety. Variety is the spice of life, and we should take that with our landscapes as well. And I'm going to talk about this in week 3, but I'm going to talk about planting for different seasons because, of course, that's part of that biodiversity and that variety, that you're not just getting something that's blooming at one point in time, right? That you're getting things that bloom across many seasons. But before you do anything, I like people to take a really good look at their site or at your property. And it's okay to take some time with this. I mean, maybe if you're a brand new homeowner, like I just saw someone in the chat box say, especially this area, maybe you take a full year to kind of take a look at your landscape and see how it behaves, see how the water moves, see what the soil looks like, dig a hole, or take a soil test, even better. But this site evaluation is really critical because it's part of this planning process. It's not as simple as, is it a plant that likes light or shade? That's just one component. We think about also soil moisture. So we can have some heavy wet soils here on the Eastern Shore. There's also parts of the Eastern Shore that are very sandy. Caroline County, I'm always jealous of their sandy soils. But some soils are almost too well drained. And so you have to think about that spectrum of where your property lies. And if you really think about it, you can answer some of these questions already. Soil texture is another one. This is when we talk about, are they clay soils? Are they loam? Are they sandy? Those are all different soil texture types. And so if you have like a finer soil type, it probably means it's wet more often than not. And when it does get wet, it holds on to that moisture for a really long time. So you want to make sure you're getting plants that are well adapted to being wet over the long course of time. There's a lot of non-natives like arborvitae and boxwood that do not like wet feet. And yet we plant them pretty freely into our landscapes. And then we get confused about why they don't make it or why they don't thrive. And it's usually because a soil issue, right? So the soil supports everything in plants. So we should also pay attention to it. And one little tricky part about living on the bay and near the ocean is salinity. A lot of other states don't have to worry about salt tolerance, but we're lucky in that we do. We do love our shorelines, but in that respect, we also have to worry about salt water intrusion. And that can happen a lot further inland than people think because soils act like a wick, right? So it's like wearing cotton jeans that are too long and you step in a puddle, up goes that water, right? It goes all the way up your legs. So it's the same thing with our soils. They can uptake that salt and bring it into higher versions of the soil. So these are all things that you should consider, especially if you're just getting started. And if you're confused, if you don't know where to start with your soils, I highly recommend using this website. This is sort of new to me. There's something called the Web Soil Survey, which you can also use. That's US Geological Service who does that. But I actually like this website better because it's more of an interactive map. So you can actually just click on your location and it gives you the information that you see on the left side of the screen, which is information about the soil profile. So you can kind of see what different soil horizons you have. And that usually equates to like there's an organic layer on top, and then there's kind of like your top soil part. And then, as you get deeper, of course, most people aren't getting beyond zone BE if you're digging. But it's still some interesting information. There's more information in these drop down menus that you can kind of see how well drained your soil is. Usually they classify soils based on their drainage. And I'm sorry to say that at least most of Talbot County is poorly drained, right? So hopefully you have some better drainage than I do, but this is a great way to sort of explore what the parent soil material looks like and what it would be like. And so even if you don't understand what all this information means, it's still a good thing to kind of explore. And I bet you'll get more information from it than you think. And it might help explain to you why some parts of your property might be better drained than others. Okay, so I used my property as sort of an example because it's what I did in the first couple of years when I moved in. Thinking about sites where keeping grass or keeping turf might be a good idea for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's because you like to do picnics out on your front yard, or you have a play set or grandchildren, children who like to play, or you have a septic field that you can't quite plant yet. So those are areas you probably want to stay away from when you're looking at planting. But then there might be other areas you can kind of identify after living there for a while that might be more challenging. Maybe they are too shaded and the grass is really sparse underneath of trees, which is what happens because I have a lot of red maples, which have a lot of roots that don't let grass grow. It's also very shady. Grass doesn't like shade. I also have a lot of wet areas. So prime opportunity for, a rain garden or even just a wet garden. It doesn't have to be a rain garden. Areas where water is gathering. And if you don't know where water has gathered, especially after this last rainstorm we just had, then lucky you, you don't have any ponds in your front yard because, man, it's been a long time since I've had that much water in my front yard. And here's another example, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's not even turf grass. I can't even call it that because it's just weeds, because it is wet so much of the year, that grass just simply won't grow. And you can actually see just visually looking at it, that is not a well-drained site. It seems to be fine everywhere around it, but this is where the water tends to gather. And the soil might be a little bit different than everything around it. So this might be a prime area for like a wet meadow, or even a rain garden if that's available to you. But that's a great example of where I could turn this spot into something for native landscaping that might absorb more of that water. And not only that, it would be happy in that wet area. Okay, so these are the lists I'm gonna go over. Okay, I have a list for everything. So if there's a plant list you want me to make that's not on this list, I'm happy to do it. Just send me an email, which I will share at the end of this presentation. But these are a lot of the different growing conditions we can kind of experience out here on the Eastern Shore. The one thing I'm not going to cover is beneficial insects and pollinators, because of course I'm going to go more into depth about that next week. All right, so again, while we have coastal shoreline, it presents one challenge of that salt water. And you may notice that a lot of plants are not salt tolerant. You may find actually quite a few plants that like the roadsides because they are salt tolerant, and they actually can outcompete some of these other plants that are not. So there's actually this whole adapted list of plants for salt tolerant conditions. Salt meadow hay is a native grass to the Eastern Shore, and this is a really great one. And I tend to recommend it a lot, especially for shorelines or waterfront, because it looks a lot like turf grass and actually can behave quite a bit like it, but it's not very tall, so you don't have to mow it, you don't have to treat it like that. It doesn't impede people's view of the water, which I am conscious of. A lot of people will say, oh, I don't want anything to be too tall because I like to see the water. Well, a lot of these, with the exception of the shrubs and the trees, don't get so tall that they're going to impede your view. And these still add a lot of color to those shorelines, as well as texture and habitat. So salt meadow hay, marsh hibiscus, which I have a picture of. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, to keep in mind, these plants have a variety of how upland they are to how deep in the water that they are. And that's something you want to be cognizant of. So marsh hibiscus can actually grow almost right into the water. So that's something that you would plant around like the mean high water line. But salt meadow hay is something that you would want to plant upland, because it doesn't like to be completely wet, doesn't like to be drenched. And so that's more of an upland plant. Goldenrod, seaside goldenrod is the same. It likes to be sort of upland. Now, one thing I love about seaside goldenrod is it's great for sandier soils. It actually can grow in straight sand dune, like down at Assateague, if you ever go down there. And it's pretty amazing that anything can survive that kind of environment. But goldenrod is one of those key species we use for pollinators because it is such a late season bloomer. It also is a very lively color. I actually love the texture of goldenrod, or the seaside goldenrod, because its leaves are very different than the goldenrod we see like in the ditches as we drive along the road. It's a little bit thicker. They're almost sort of like a succulent. And that's probably because they have to adapt to retaining moisture in those sandier soils. Wax myrtle is a nice evergreen shrub that provides some winter interest in berries for our wildlife. We have switchgrass, which is a highly adaptable plant. In fact, you might find that I talk about several of these plants in different slides or on different lists because they are so adaptable. They can pretty much be on any list, you know what I mean? So switchgrass is one of those plants. Blue flag iris is surprising that it has some salt tolerance. Now it's a pretty low tolerance, so I wouldn't recommend putting it like right on a shoreline. But if you are getting saltwater inundation periodically, it can handle it. It also is a nice alternative as our native iris to some of the other irises that we see out there. And then red cedar, which is a very hard tree to kill, including saltwater. It's very salt tolerant, but it also provides not only evergreen cover for birds, but its berries are consumed by, I think, over 48 species of birds, which in wintertime is really critical because there's not much in the way of insects, right? You know, that like what else are they going to eat? And so the berries are really high in fat, which is incredible, high in fat and protein. And that's what birds really need to survive winter. So these are all really beneficial plants on many fronts. And I tried to select a lot that were also attractive in their blooms. So the marsh hibiscus, which I think, oh, it must be on another slide that I have marsh hibiscus. It's a very large flower, but up in the top left corner, that's the salt meadow hay. Now it actually looks taller in this picture than it actually is because it was planted on like a berm. So so it actually is not that tall. But in front of it actually is bayberries. So that's a line of bayberries. This is a shoreline in St. Michael's. And yeah, it's actually a great combination of having those two because the bayberries stabilize the shoreline, and then the spartina or the salt meadow hay kind of helps you transition into the turf grass area. The blue flag iris is in the bottom left. They have, as you'll notice, the leaves in the background, they have kind of a thick, coarse texture, very similar to not the Siberian irises, which have the very skinny leaves, but very much like the other, the bearded irises that are a little bit thicker. And then the plant on the right is actually switchgrass, and it's a bunch forming grass that handles both dry and wet conditions. This is what it looks like in the winter. I'm actually surprised it's staying upright. But these kinds of grasses are very critical for birds and insects that are overwintering because it provides cover and insulation from sort of the harsh environments. You try sitting out in January and not freezing your butt off. So like this is a great spot. I would hide in here too if I was stuck outside all winter. All right, talking about freshwater and wet sites. So again, this list is going to be different than the shoreline or coastal list because these plants do not have salt tolerance. Now, it should be said that you could actually take coastal plants and put them in freshwater sites, but we usually use them because of their saltwater tolerance. So you don't see them in freshwater ponds or wetlands very often. Cardinal flower is one of my favorites. It's one of the ones that is bright red. So it's one of the few species we have natively that blooms that really vibrant color. It's really good as a late summer bloomer. It's also really great for hummingbirds because hummingbirds love red tubular flowers, and that's exactly what it looks like. And Joe Pye weed, I apologize, I don't know what happened to the scientific name for that, but we actually have quite a few different species of Joe Pye. It's a Eutrochium, and it can be a very tall perennial, actually. I didn't even put the height on there because it varies. It can go anywhere from like 3 feet, which is the coastal Joe Pye, to 10 feet, which is the trumpet Joe Pye or trumpet weed. And then it shouldn't be discredited to use ferns and sedges in the landscape. It shouldn't be all flowering perennials because ferns and sedges are really great for shaded wet environments, which a lot of us have. So I think they often get ignored, but we should be utilizing things like lady fern or actually tussock sedge likes full sun, so that's not a great example, but we have a lot of other sedges that like shade. And you can see some of them don't have any flower or bloom, but like in terms of lady fern, you're growing it for its foliage. You're not growing it for like a flower, and it's very attractive. It's a very lacy, fine-leafed fern. I also tried to include some shrubs and trees that would be really beneficial. And luckily we have some really good examples, attractive examples like buttonbush. If anybody knows what buttonbush looks like, I have a picture on the next slide, but it is something that when it blooms, it will just be covered in pollinators. They love it. And I don't even worry about getting too close with my camera because they could care less about me. They're so obsessed with these flowers and how they smell, that I'm not important. So the same thing happens with clethra, or the summer sweet. This is another shrub that the pollinators go crazy for. And they bloom at similar times, but they're both very attractive and different looking flowers. River birches, if you're looking for trees, not only do they handle wet sites very well, they handle clay, they can actually handle periodic drying out as well. So periodic drought is okay for river birches. They can handle it. And they have very attractive bark in the middle of winter. I planted almost my entire front yard with river birches, and I'm telling you, this time of year, it just brings me so much joy to see the bark because it's like an orange color. It's a great texture. It just adds some vibrancy to the winter landscape. Sweet bay magnolias also are a really fantastic tree. This is another one that it can grow in inundation or water, like, standing up to 6 inches, or it can grow in a completely dry parking lot, which is where I sometimes see them, and they seem to do just fine there. So this is a very adaptable plant as well. So if you're not sure about your soil moisture type, sweet bay magnolia is a great choice because you can't go wrong. All right, so here are some examples of those, some of those plants I covered. So that's tussock sedge in the top left corner. It's a perennial, even though it looks very grassy. So it's kind of a grass-like plant, but you'll see it actually does have flowers or blooms. And that's not even a really good picture. I need a better one. The blooms are actually a little bit more attractive than that. They stand out a little bit more. So for people who like the appearance of turf, but maybe have a spot that's a little too wet for it, this is a great option. New York ironweed is in the top right corner. That's a really vibrantly colored flower. And then there's our marsh hibiscus down in the bottom right corner. And these are, they're like 6 to 8 inches across. They're a very large flower, and you can have a variety that's white with like a dark maroon or pink eye, or you can have this variation that is actually pink petals with a darker pink eye. And then there's the button bush on the bottom left. It's one of my favorite shrubs. Really great for wet areas where you have these challenging spots of water. And I recently learned the seed heads, once these flowers are kind of spent and it goes into making the seed are favored by a lot of our waterfowl species. So they have benefits on many, many fronts. Okay, so we're going to go opposite now. We're going to go to the dry sun or meadow kind of area. So let's say you have a spot where you're tired of mowing grass and it's dry enough where you can do a meadow like this. You can even do as big or as small of a meadow as you want. But these are plants that I would choose to put in the meadow based on the variety of flowers that they have and the variety of blooming they have. I've also thrown in a couple of native grasses, which I love native grasses. I could do a whole class just on that topic. And so I always like to take the opportunity to encourage people to use them in the landscape because native grasses have so many benefits, including their substantial root systems, which not only prevent erosion, they're also really excellent at soaking up water. So milkweeds, no meadow should go without having a milkweed of some kind. We have 3 different species here. There's Asclepias seriosa, which is actually the common milkweed. That's the one you usually see as you're driving down the road. It's kind of in the ditches. It likes terrible soils. So if you have a terrible dry soil, that's going to be a great plant for you. And once it gets established, it forms like a really nice population, which is important because you need lots of milkweed to support all those monarch butterflies, right? But if you were looking for a milkweed that was more tamed for the landscape, like you have a smaller space, I always like to encourage Asclepias tuberosa, which is butterfly weed. This is the orange blooming milkweed. Um, and it's a great one for the landscape because it does not get too big. The common milkweeds tend to get a little tall. We actually have a swamp milkweed for wet environments. So, but these two do better in dry areas. Broom sedge is a common grass that we have around here. In fact, it's most prominent this time of year because you can actually look outside or you can drive down the road, and it's the grass that looks bronze or like orange in color. I think it just has the most attractive winter color when everything else is kind of dead and brown. But honestly, it just has many benefits to it. A couple more that I like to talk about, monardas or horse mint, and I think I have a picture of that in the next slide. Beard tongues, which is a type of flowering perennial that doesn't get too tall. It actually has its flowers on a stalk. And there's quite a few bees that are favorable to beard tongue, as well as black-eyed Susans, right? We're in Maryland. We should probably have a black-eyed Susan on our property. It seems patriotic. The other thing I really like that a lot of people don't think about is blazing star. And this is called Liatris. And we have a couple of different species of this, but basically the flower grows on a big kind of club-like flower stalk. And then it has these violet, very bright purple flowers that bloom all over that stalk. Very cool plant. I can't remember if I threw a picture in or not, but look it up if you don't know. All right, so here are some of my, so there's the butterfly weed in the top left corner, very appealing in terms of its color because not many things are orange when they bloom. The plant in the top right is actually horse mint, Monarda punctata, and this is great for sandier or drier environments. It does not tolerate moist soils very well, so this is better for like a really dry environment. But that is about the funkiest flower you could ever find, and it's a very popular with the bees. It falls into the bee balm group, so it's very popular with pollinators. It's in the mint family as well, so it's very fragrant. And then on the bottom are my two favorite grasses that were in the list we just looked at. The grass on the left that's a little bit more orangey, that's the broom sedge. And growing right next to it on the right is a little blue stem, which is reddish in color in the fall. Super attractive fall color. You know, it's just one of those grasses you can't go wrong with. It's the grass I recommend for people who don't like native grasses because I think it wins them over. All right, and ground covers. Often people are planting ground covers because turf grass hasn't worked out or they're trying to cover bare soil. And so all of these choices that I've listed are plants that don't get above 1 foot tall. They're very short. And they grow in very different environments. So that's very useful to know, especially if you're trying to replace turf grass that isn't growing very well because they might not be well adapted to the environment. Well, here are the tolerances and different ground covers that I would recommend for those circumstances. Although I just noticed, just looking now, that a lot of them bloom in the spring, and I don't know why that is, but never hurts to have something blooming in the spring, right? The only one that doesn't really bloom on my list is the one on the bottom left corner. The picture is of wild ginger. So this is a ground cover that's very, very good for woodland or shaded environments. So rich woodland soils, they do have a flower technically, but it blooms upside down and it blooms very close to the soil. So you probably never see it, but the ground cover itself is semi-evergreen, so it actually stays green for most of the winter, especially on the Eastern Shore. So it's very useful in that it still provides a little bit of green in the winter. And then the blue-eyed grass, which is actually not a grass, it's a perennial. It just looks grass-like because of its leaves. You can tell in this picture, You might mistake it for a grass, but it's actually a tiny iris. It's in the iris family. It's very cute. Very good ground cover. In fact, once you get a good clump going, you can actually divide it, split it up, just like you would irises. And you can replant these clumps, and then they just kind of continue to grow and fill in. Really, really cool plant. All right, and now this is a very challenging environment, is the dry shade. There's not a lot of plants that grow in dry shade, but I found a lot of native plants that do. So here we have our sedges again. Pennsylvania sedge is really good for dry shade. It also looks a lot like turf grass, so sometimes I recommend it as a lawn alternative for dry, shady environments because it also doesn't get very tall. So there might not be any need to mow it if it's so short. White wood asters, I have a picture of that in the next couple of slides. Foam flower is a great one. This is a kind of a ground cover perennial. It's really good for growing under trees because it's very shallow rooted, so it can grow along the tops of the tree roots if you don't have a lot of topsoil to work with. So that's a really great recommendation I have. Some of the blue mist flower is another plant that will grow. This could go on any list, to be honest. It grows in every kind of environment you can imagine. And it's a really cool flower. I think I do have a picture of it in the next couple of slides. And there's goldenrods that bloom in the shade as well. Wreath goldenrod and zigzag goldenrods are great for woodland environments. So I like to say there's no excuse not to have goldenrod on your property as well, because it is such a great species for wildlife. But some of these other blooming ones, the heart-leafed aster, and then the golden alexanders is what's in the bottom left corner. And this is a low-growing perennial. It actually supports the black swallowtail butterfly. If you've noticed, those are the ones that eat carrot family and dill and parsley. Well, golden alexanders actually belongs to that carrot family, and so they will also eat this plant. And so you'll sometimes have those caterpillars show up. It's a lot of fun. I love to collect caterpillars, for my job, obviously, but of course we also like to support those caterpillar species. And then there's the white wood aster on the right. This is one that's great for a location where you want the plants to spread, right? I like plants that do well despite me. Okay, so I do my best to kill plants sometimes, but I love plants that keep going regardless of my involvement or not. And that's this white wood aster will grow very easily in dry shade, and it will spread. Okay, so there's the wreath. The wreath goldenrod is on the left, and the foam flower is on the right. This is the one that grows really well in across like root systems. Okay, now shady, moist areas. This is where you're going to see a lot of my fern recommendations, as well as some other ground covers. Wild ginger also does moist soil, not wet. So it will handle wet shade as well as sort of dry shade. Sensitive ferns, cinnamon fern, these are all really great fern species because they not only like the shade, they'll also handle this wet area very well, and they have attractive foliage. Now cinnamon fern can get pretty big. It can look a little Jurassic Parky, but it still is a really attractive one. Actually, northern maidenhair fern is my favorite fern, which I have a picture of course. And there's even things that still bloom in the shade, like common boneset, sneezeweed, and Virginia bluebells, which are almost like a spring ephemeral. And I have a really good picture of them, I think, coming up. Golden ragwort, which its name doesn't sound very attractive, but I have the picture of the Virginia bluebells and ragwort together because they bloom at a similar time in the spring, and it looks really attractive, but they do really well in moist shaded areas. And there's the maidenhair fern on the bottom right corner, the northern maidenhair fern. It's just a really cool looking, not other ferns don't look like that. So it's kind of a cool thing to have. It does really well on slopes, believe it or not. So if you have a moist slope, that's a great spot for it. Yeah, here we go. So this is Virginia bluebells is in the forefront and golden ragwort is kind of in the background. And this is along a riverside bed. So it's obviously pretty moist, pretty wet sometimes. But they bloom really well together. And it's really nice if you can find a location where they can kind of roam because they do like to spread out. So it would not be a good choice for like a very small landscape. All right. And these are like my silver bullet plants for tough environments. So if you're not sure if something is going to survive an environment, I would pick something off of this list because they're pretty hard to kill. And if they do get established, they spread pretty easily. So these are the kinds of plants I like to recommend if you're doing like an invasive plant removal and you're trying to replant it with something that's going to compete with those invasive plants. I picked something from here, or many of them from here. And actually, that's the blue mist flower that's in the forefront. It's a really cool plant in the mint family. So obviously a mint is going to wander a little bit, but I find so many interesting pollinators just on this plant. So if you're interested in having a biodiverse kind of insect life in your landscape, this is the one to plant. You can do a lot with anything in the mint family, okay? Okay, so here's the link list of what I kind of covered in my presentation. We don't have to answer that question right now, but this is a great time for me to kind of ask questions. Oh, good, I'm perfect on time. I want to make sure to have plenty of time for questions. You can either feel free to put your question in the chat and I'll answer it, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask it, that's fine too.
So, Mikaela, you said you were going to provide a PDF or a file of all of this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank
I do not expect you to remember all those plant lists.
Yeah, thank you. And I have one other question. That last slide you showed us of the bluebells and something golden behind it. What was the
Yes.
golden behind it?
Golden ragwort,
Okay.
Pachyra aurea. In fact, I think it's on, yep,
Okay.
it's the first plant on this page.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And that is something that will spread. I like to warn people,
Yeah.
but I like things that spread because it's less that I have to weed and mulch. So,
Great.
yeah.
And I have one more question. When you have spreaders like that,
Yeah.
will other things that you've planted grow up from underneath that or
Oh, good question.
yeah.
I think it depends on what it is and if the plant is vigorous enough, you know what I mean?
Okay. Okay. Got
Yeah,
it.
I think it really depends, but it is very possible that it could overtake something. So like a good example in this case, Jack in the Pulpit. I'm not sure how Jack in the Pulpit would show up in the midst of this kind of planting, because the
Okay.
bluebells and the Pachyra are so so thick, so
Thick.
aggressive.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Do I have any other questions? We're about to spend the next couple of weeks together. So, don't worry if you don't have something right now. You can also always email me, and I'm actually gonna, I don't know if my email was on one of the slides, but I put my email in the chat box. And I'll be sending out an email to follow up from today, but also it has some links to either a survey or an evaluation, just to get an idea to make sure that we're on the right track for the next couple of weeks.
Mikaela, I have a question.
Yes.
And it has to do with common milkweed.
Oh, okay.
And I planted a large patch in the middle of a field.
Okay.
And there are a few other native plants in there, but not a lot. I said that although the caterpillars need the milkweed, this is a very thick patch. They need the milkweed, the caterpillars, to eat them. They rarely pupate on the milkweed. And I realized that my caterpillars would have to crawl across mowed lawn to get to other native plants to pupate on. And I wondered how true that was, because it is true that I don't see a huge number of pupa around my
Right. You know, and unfortunately, Peggy, I have noticed the same thing, especially the last couple of years. I feel like monarch populations have been really down. And partly that's because I think only 10% of caterpillars make it to adulthood without a disease or something predating on it. So I can't say I'm totally surprised you're not seeing a lot of the pupa. One recommendation I might make is planting something that has sort of woody stems. You know, it doesn't have to be a woody plant per se, but you could do like a taller goldenrod or something that has a really tall, strong stem nearby. And then that way that gives them something to sort of climb. Because a lot of caterpillars do that. Once they're ready to pupate, they seek and they actually look for higher ground. Now, but they should be pupating even on the milkweed itself. So my guess is something is animals or something has figured out where they are and could pick them off really easily. But that might be, yeah, I don't think they necessarily will go away from the patch or that they need to in order to pupate. They should be able to pupate pretty much anywhere they can hang from. But yeah, maybe a taller goldenrod or a taller plant with a stiff stem, that might help.
There's a lot of Joe Pye in there, but it.
Oh, well, then perfect. They should be able to use that then. And you know what? You might not, their chrysalis might be better hidden than you thought. I'm hoping for your sake that that you're just not able to see the pupa. All right, good questions, you guys. And like I said, we're going to cover insects and pollinators in a lot more detail next week. And I'm going to kind of focus in on plants that are sort of the best for supporting those populations. Okay.
I live in Rock Hall, right on the shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And
nice.
Yeah, I agree with you. And when I had a tree fall over, I wanted to plant southern wax myrtle to replace it. So I went to a local garden center and I ordered it, and they shipped in northern wax myrtle, and they told me that it would be just as good. And but from my reading, it doesn't make berries. It's growing, but you know, I get salt spray routinely across the front of the bay. So should I just replace it, or maybe put some southerns in between it, or something like that?
I would say if it's still alive, I would leave it. So they do form berries, but the problem is they need several species to cross-pollinate. And so if there's only one of them, and if it's a male, it won't produce berries at all. It will produce on the female plants. So that's what I would probably do, is get a couple of wax myrtles and put them in place as well. Because I agree, even though northern bayberry, it's a great plant, it's not as attractive as the southern wax myrtle. Because they lose half of their leaves. They're semi-deciduous, so they will lose half their leaves. Whereas the wax myrtle is pretty much evergreen. So I'm with you. I like the wax myrtles. I think they're a little more attractive, but I don't think you need to remove the northern bayberry unless it's really a problem. But I think it's worth getting the southern wax myrtles.
I haven't seen berries yet. How do I? There are two of them. I did two, so that but, you know, it's kind of a crapshoot what you get.
Yeah, I was gonna say, unless you know that one's a female and one's a male, you probably won't see berries. It also takes some time. I don't know how big they are or how old they are.
They're 3 years old, and they're about 2 feet tall.
Okay, you should start to see berries by now, but it's possible you have either two females or two males. So if you get southern wax myrtles, I would say make sure wherever you're getting them from, you are able to get a male and a female so that you have that. The berries. The berries are just great.
Okay.
Good questions. Catherine, yes. So I can send out a list of nurseries that do like native plant. You say native plant plugs, so not containers, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So let me get back to you with a list about that because most of our local nurseries are going to be in containers. And so typically if you're looking for plant plugs, you're going to be ordering out. Now I will say Environmental Concern in St. Michael's will grow them from plugs, but those are mostly like wetland or shoreline plants. But we do have a couple of other places on the Eastern Shore that would be good. Someone mentioned the place on 213. I think you mean Unity Nursery. They tend to carry, they tend to carry a pretty good variety of native plants. I don't think
And
they do plugs
They have
though.
plugs also.
Oh,
Oh, they
yes.
do? Okay, excellent. That's
Yes,
good
they
to
have
know.
plugs. And they're specific as to whether it's a wet area, dry area, etc.
Perfect. Yep, that's a challenge as homeowners and landowners as well, is sourcing native plants because while we're starting to catch up now, a lot of places are starting to carry them more. A lot of our traditional nurseries still don't carry the amount of species that I would like or that I would like to see. So sometimes you're limited by what's in cultivation and what's not. So we're lucky
Actually,
though. I do
with
think we have
Unity-
fairly good sources in Maryland.
I'm sorry. With Unity, you can actually go online and download a list of the plants that they have and what size, if you're looking for containers. So I put in a
Nice.
button bush this past year, and sometimes you can only get one or two, but they actually specialize in native plants in their planting. So if you're thinking about having a large area done, they're the type of group you'd want to have come in and kind of plan with you. Because
Right.
they specialize in that.
Yes, and somebody else mentioned Adkins Arboretum. Yes, their plant sale will be coming up in this spring. In fact, I think they release it. They release the list in either February or March, so it's good to pay attention to that too. I can't speak for like Cecil County. I don't know if anybody knows of some nurseries up there, but I know Unity, Adkins, Environmental Concern, and there's even some places down near Hurlock and Salisbury that do native plants as well. And across the bridge, but I try and avoid that, especially after this past weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, who
Our-
wants to cross the bridge?
Yeah, nobody wants to cross the bridge.
Yeah.
So
All
I
right.
understand the whole native plant thing, and I understand that they developed with here and the local stuff, but the local weather has changed. The local
Right.
bug population has changed.
Yep.
Do they adapt? I mean, like now we have lanternflies, which were never around before.
Right. And so I think it's important to distinguish between introduced species. So that's humans' fault. Well, climate change is also our fault, but we do have these shifting climates. Now, the good news is our native plants tend to have a pretty wide range. With the exception of we probably can't grow things that grow in the mountains anyways, or things that require elevation. But our plant communities will be very similar to what they experience south of here. So I think we'll still have a pretty deep bench in terms of what native plants are going to be able to plant, because their range tends to go through the coastals anyways. So things like in North Carolina, South Carolina, I think we're going to expect to see a lot more of those species, but a lot of them are very similar as well. But you're right, it's an ever-changing environment. The one thing I would recommend to people is if you're going to buy a tree or something that's very long-lived, just check and make sure to see that we are not already on the southern edge of their growing range, because chances are, as our climate shifts a little bit. Things that we already are on the southern tip, and we're probably not going to be able to support those kinds of species in 10 to 30 years. One example I use is, what is it, mountain ash. So there are parts of Maryland that can grow mountain ash that are native to there. Well, after our most recent release of the growing, the plant hardiness zones, they probably won't be able to grow them anymore because they need a more northern climate. But things like loblolly, red maples, these are what we kind of call climate resilient species because they'll be able to kind of withstand that climatic shift. And they're so widespread that they'll be able to survive pretty easily. But really good point.
You spoke of oaks. What
Yes.
varieties of oaks?
Oh my goodness, we have many. It really
Yeah,
depends.
Are they all good?
Yes, although I like to warn people that we do have a couple of blights out there, although they're usually pretty specific to like either the red oak group or the white oak group. And so like the red oaks are susceptible to what is it? Sudden oak blight. What I would say is that I would stick with species that can handle a wetter soil. So swamp white oak, willow oaks, even white oak, but I almost prefer swamp white oak when it's a wetter environment. Because they can handle getting wet feet without having the root rot that's associated with it. Even pin oaks, although pin oaks can get a couple of diseases as well. Southern red oak is another really good one. That's a pretty one. Black oaks. Yeah, we have quite a few species. Any other questions? Oh, we're just over 11. So perfect timing, everyone. I will send a follow-up to today with all of our lists that we went over. And then I will also send out I'm going to try and send you a reminder next week that 10 o'clock on Monday morning, because I know we sometimes forget when it's Monday morning. But I hope you enjoy oh, I'm sorry, I just saw a dry tolerant oak. Oh, definitely bur oak. Sand tolerant oak, yeah, bur oak. Even water oak. And I'm trying to remember its species name right now. I'll have to look it up. I'll get Catherine, I'll follow up with you about those two different recommendations because I can probably come up with more the more I sit here. All right. Well, I'll let everybody go. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you back here Monday next week.
Thank you, Mikaela.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.